Hi, I'm Dr. Sue Rotman, and I would like to talk to you about this Behaviour Changer Framework, which we're using in Task 24 Phase 2, called Helping the Behaviour Changers. And because it's quite a complex diagram, I will talk you through it step by step. Just so you know, this diagram is a very generic one, whereas we are going to delve much deeper in focus on specific end users and a specific behavior or practice that we're wanting to change. So this is a more generalized version, but it's just to give you an idea. It's also kind of the New Zealand energy system because that is what I'm most familiar with. So let's start with the end user. This is the end user, hopefully a happy chap. What we're going to discuss here when we're doing this in workshops is to find out who the exact end user or group of end users is, if we have already targeted or segmented them, for example, in a specific energy culture, if it's a low or high energy user, if it's a specific demographic, or if it's office workers, etc. The second circle that we're looking at is the actual behavior that we're trying to change, and we really need to focus very clearly on what it is that we're changing and what we're discussing. There's several types of behavior. There could be a behavior of different groups. For example, if the end user that we're looking at is landlords, it could be around split incentive issues. It could be a more one-off investment behavior we're trying to change, or it could be more routine purchasing behaviors, or it could actually be completely changing the way we use our energy or not use it, or switch between technologies, etc. So we need to be very clear which behavior it is that we're looking at. Potentially we could also look at practices or social norm changes, but that needs to be discussed right here. The next circle is technology, which is where we're going to discuss which specific technology or technologies are involved in terms of the current behavior and the behavior that we're trying to change. So that may be either, for example, the purchase of more efficient technologies, or the switch to a more efficient technology, or a better use of a technology as we're currently doing it, or not using a technology. The next circle is very important. It's about the social influences of this specific end user group. For example, if the end user group is landlords, then we'd assume that in that social circle is other landlords, landlord associations, tenants, etc. If it is individuals, then we can assume that it is the wider peer group, the family and friends, potentially the workmates, etc. Infrastructure is also very important, because if the infrastructure isn't there, then it's very difficult to change behavior. For example, if you want to change mode switching from getting people to stop driving to work and instead of taking public transport, if there is no bus stop within half an hour walking distance from the home, then it's very unlikely that they're going to switch to buses. Or if you don't have a roof space or underfloor space for insulation, then it's unlikely that people are going to insulate their homes. So the infrastructure discussion is an important one. And lastly, there's the wider environment, which is to understand the wider context that the end user and their behavior operate under. For example, the geographic environment, the climatic environment, the political environment. There's going to be a big difference if it's a right-wing government that is very neoliberal in its policies, or if it's a left-wing government that's very social or socialist in their policies. All these things are also influencing this behavior. So this is now our understanding of the specific end user that we're trying to change, and their specific behavior that we're trying to change, in the wider context that operate with it. And now we're going to the actors that are sitting around the end user and who are what we call the behavior changers, who are trying to change their behavior. So right at the top, and probably the most important one, is the decision maker, as we call them. They're usually government officials, and they can either be an energy minister or CEOs of energy ministries or energy departments, energy agencies, or smaller groups, and of course local government can be also a very important driver there. Now, they have some of the most powerful behavior change intervention tools in their toolbox. For example, they can change policies, they can change national legislation, they can put in regulation, they can change taxes, they can give subsidies, loans, they can ask for penalties, they can do national information campaigns, etc. Very powerful tools. The problem with the decision maker, and what we're going to discuss a little bit with all of these behavior changes, is what the primary and secondary mandates is. Depending on who the decision maker is that we are talking about right now, the primary mandate of, for example, the energy minister is to actually get voted in again, to keep the prime minister and his party happy and to keep the voters happy. That very often means that his most powerful tool in the toolbox, which is regulation, is the one that he's least likely to use, because voters usually don't look so favourable upon having regulation imposed on them, particularly if there wasn't a social norm change that has taken place that has clearly explained why this regulation would be necessary. If the decision maker is, for example, the CEO of the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority, then their primary mandate is still to keep the minister happy, which goes against a secondary mandate, which is to do public good, particularly around getting greater energy efficiency and conservation happening in New Zealand. The primary mandate of the energy minister is slightly conflicting because on the one hand, he is responsible for resource extraction, which includes fossil fuel, oil and gas exploration. He's also responsible for keeping the energy system secure, affordable, and renewable. In a lot of cases in New Zealand, we have over 80% renewables. And then he's also in charge of implementing energy efficiency and conservation. And there's obviously some conflicts built into the system here, which makes it very difficult for decision makers in various levels to deal with, and this needs to be understood. Another very important behaviour changer in the energy system, probably the most important one because he's actually the one that keeps the energy system going, is the provider, as we call them. And that is basically the energy industry. That can be anyone from gentellers, retailers or generators, to energy supply in all its forms, transmission and distribution, technology innovators, etc. So again, it's very important to understand what the primary mandate is. It's to keep the energy system going. It's to actually supply a country and its people with energy in an affordable, secure and efficient way. And also, probably even more, its primary mandate is to its shareholders and to make money. And that always needs to be understood. There is obviously, again, an inherent conflict in energy conservation and making money out of selling energy. And that is something that needs to be understood when discussing the behaviour change tools that the provider has in its toolbox. The biggest one is, of course, the direct access to consumers. They basically can go into the home, or at least they bring energy right into the home. They have, of course, a lot of money to spend on marketing and information campaigns in order to get more consumers or to keep them, and billing and feedback, which is a very, very powerful tool in the behaviour change toolbox. The next important behaviour changer is the expert. That's basically anyone who undertakes research into the energy system or evaluates the energy system. They fall under two main categories. There is academics and universities, whose primary mandate is to create new knowledge. And then there is consultants, whose primary mandate is to actually make money out of providing knowledge for whoever pays them to understand specific aspects of the energy system that they are involved in. Again, they do have very powerful tools in their toolbox. Of course, there is scientific papers, there's technical reports. They can also write magazine articles or give expert interviews, evaluate the system. The problem is with academics that the way most research and academic institutions are based, their primary mandate to the university is to actually publish as many scientific papers and as much obscure primary literature in the jargon that is very disciplinary, and it thus doesn't really lend itself to provide the easiest access to the knowledge that they have created, or especially the new knowledge. Consultants' primary mandate is to whoever their clients are and what specific issue they are trying to get them to answer or to report on. It is very often commercially sensitive, and it doesn't often take the wider framework into account because it's usually on very specific problems that they're reporting on. So even though the experts are the creators and holders of most of the knowledge around the energy system, it isn't always very easy to get access to it in a way that is understood by the rest of the system. Down here we have the conscience. The conscience are various community groups. It could be NGOs, it could be transition town movements, it could be people involved in assessing any kind of accountability around trade, fair trade, the behaviour of tradespeople, etc. The conscience has a higher mandate, which is to the wider society or the wider environment. They usually are really the environmental and social conscience that the energy system doesn't impact too much on these areas. So their primary mandate is usually to the public good and to the greater good of society or the environment. The problem is that they very often are a little bit on the outs of the system, and depending on what specific group they belong to, they may not have access to the level of expertise or the level of funding that some of the other behaviour changer groups have. But they do have some important tools in the toolboxes. A lot of them do usually have quite close relationships with, for example, a Commerce Commission that holds the system accountable. They are very good at using the media. They are often very good at mass marketing and creating activist campaigns and grassroots campaigns. And it's a very bottom-up way of dealing with the system and holding it accountable. And lastly, what I think is probably the most important group are the intermediaries, and they can be anyone who interacts with the end user, who sells them technology that uses energy, or who teaches them about energy services and how they can be utilised better. Are usually people who go into our homes or sell us our cars, repair our tools, sell us technology, etc. They have obviously very important behaviour tools in the toolbox. The direct access to consumers is the most important one. They also have usually a lot of technological information which they can provide. There is obviously also the possibility for misinformation if the mandate isn't about selling the most energy efficient products, but whatever is their retailer's main brand, for example. They have access to various labels. They obviously have a lot of money for advertising that's usually used. There are standards that are around the way they conduct themselves or the products that they're selling, etc. So if we're looking at the relationships between some of these behaviour changes, we have a very strong relationship between the provider and the decision maker. In New Zealand, even more so than in most countries, because most of the energy gentailers, as we call them, are still Crown owned, which means that the minister is the number one shareholder. So the minister profits directly from the energy providers making money out of the energy that they sell. So that is obviously, again, another conflict between the minister also being in charge of energy efficiency and conservation. The other flow of this relationship is, of course, that they regulate or deregulate the energy system. We have also quite a strong connection, particularly one way towards the expert. Most experts, particularly academics, are very much dependent on government funding, and there's quite a lot of funding going into research. And then some of that knowledge flows back to the decision makers, although arguably in what form and how useful it is in order to really change their policy making, for example. There's often the disclaimer that policies aren't based on good enough research, and partly that is because the research isn't provided in a form that can be used by policymakers easily. There is also a relationship between the provider and the experts, particularly between consultants. Again, it is a providing knowledge, very specific knowledge for the client for the exchange of money. There is a less strong relationship between the decision maker and the intermediaries. It's usually more of a one-way relationship, and that is largely based on regulation. There is a strong relationship also usually one way from the providers to the intermediary, because they're usually the technology providers as well, and then the intermediaries sell that technology or install it. To go to the other parts of the system, there is some not so strong two-way relationship between the conscience and the experts. The conscience obviously usually tries very much to translate new knowledge that comes out of the experts area, particularly around environmental or social impacts, from the energy system, and sometimes they're research subjects to the experts, but that is a less strong relationship. There is a one-way relationship from the conscience to the decision makers, and that's very much based around lobbying. And there is also one-way relationships that are very much based around accountability to both the providers and the intermediaries. As I said, the conscience is there to hold the system accountable. Now, the relationship with the end users. There's a very strong relationship between the decision maker and end users, namely in the form of policy going one way and votes going the other way or not. There is also a very strong relationship between the providers and the end user. End user gives them money, and in exchange they get energy. And there is, of course, another really strong relationship between the intermediary and the end user. They give them money and get goods and services that use energy. The relationship between the expert and the end user is not as strong as the other relationships, although it is definitely a two-way relationship in the sense that some of the new knowledge that is discovered will flow to the end user via various means, but it's not necessarily always in the easiest format for them to understand or take the right information out of it. And the end user is very often a research subject, particularly for experts working in academia or universities. The relationship between the conscience and the end user is quite strong. It's a two-way relationship in the sense that the conscience is usually quite dependent on donations and financial support from the end users, and also if there is any activist campaigns or so, of course there is that kind of support via social media campaigns or going on marches or demonstrations, etc. And then the reverse support is by basically being the conscience of the system and advocating for the end user and the wider environment that they live in. So now we're going to the other behaviour changes in the system which are not directly involved in the energy system per se, but have a lot of influence over the end user and the other behaviour changes. One of them, probably one of the most important ones, is the media. The media has probably the greatest potential to actually translate knowledge, but unfortunately it also has great potential to translate quite a bit of misinformation. And some of the behaviour changes, like the providers and the decision makers, are quite petrified of any kind of bad media stories, which can often cause some problems. The next behaviour changer that is very important, but also sometimes sits outside the system, is the investor. They, of course, can choose or not to invest in all the different aspects of the energy system and the different behaviour changes, and they have quite a large amount of influence because usually that's where the money comes from. A third one that is particularly important to end users, but that actually affects all the behaviour changes in the system as well, which is family and friends, the peer group. And then last but not least, is other behaviour changes in areas such, for example, health, education, waste, etc. And they are often or more successful than behaviour changes in the energy system to change practices or norms or behaviours, and there is a lot we can learn from them. So just to make things a little bit more complicated, I have also tried to denote some of the drivers and barriers that are inherent in the socio-political and economic system that our very technocratic energy system operates under. Here are just some examples. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but the love hearts denote some very good relationships, or where the system works really well together. For example, there is an obvious good relationship between the providers and the intermediaries, with the providers providing the technology that is then being sold on to the end user via the intermediaries, and that usually is quite a strong relationship because it operates really well with the current market-driven capitalist system. There is also a good relationship between, for example, consultants, experts, and the providers, which is a very good flow of money versus knowledge and information. There is also a good relationship between the end user and the conscience, as they are inherently supporting each other. What I'm denoting here as well is the inherent conflicts, which are the bombs. or some of the barriers that are thrown up by the system. I've already talked a little bit about some issues where the minister is in charge of resource extraction, the secure and affordable way the energy system runs, is the main shareholder of the energy companies in New Zealand, and then is also supposed to be responsible for energy efficiency and conservation. So there is an obvious conflict in the system. There is a conflict between, for example, decision makers and the media. The media can really cause a lot of trouble for particularly ministers, and that's why, for example, they don't go towards the most powerful tools in the toolbox like regulation or penalties or changing legislation. There is another conflict that is built in by the highly competitive university system. For example, in New Zealand, it's all performance-based research funds. And as much as energy experts could learn from other behaviour changes in other disciplines or in other areas, there usually is some jargon issues, or there is actual competitive issues where interdisciplinarity just isn't fostered, and collaboration between research isn't fostered as much as it should be, especially in New Zealand. So what we're trying to do with this is to use this Behaviour Changer Framework to actually describe the energy system from a human perspective, through the human lens, and the different players and actors in the system, and the importance that they all have in order to change a specific behaviour that we're focusing on. So here are me and Ruth. We are basically the knowledge brokers via this phase 2 of Task 24, and we're going to use a collective impact approach, which is a way of bringing together many different behaviour changes with very different mandates and try and get them to actually figure out how we can all collaborate and co-create behaviour change interventions that will actually have ongoing lasting change, because every single one of them, as powerful as the individual tools in the toolboxes are, independently, they usually can't actually achieve long-lasting change. So what we're going to use these diagrams for in workshops in each of the participating countries is to actually invite the behaviour changers on the very specific domain and behaviour and issue that we focus on, and actually go through with them of what the system looks like currently, what the system should look like, and the best practice if we're actually managing ongoing change, and then the different steps of how we need to get there and how we can remove some of those conflicts and barriers and improve some of the relationships between the different behaviour changes and the end user. And that is what we're going to do over the next 3 years. And I really look forward to having many different examples from many different countries and different sectors and different domains and different behaviours. And hopefully this is a way of visualizing the human side of the energy system and its human actors and making it easier for them to work together. Thank you very much.